For those of you who've not met me, my name is Chris Skidmore, former Energy and Clean Growth Minister, but now proudly Chair of the All-Party Group on the Environment. We're going to have Minister Graham Stuart along with us very shortly. He's just finishing a meeting. But I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to, in terms of the format for this meeting, so we've got Minister Stuart up speaking, but unfortunately only for about 15 minutes. There's a urgent question that he has to do in the House of Commons and has to go off to prepare for that, unfortunately, such as democracy. And so he's only given us 15 minutes of his time. So what I want to do is to say to the Minister, please give a sort of short, sharp 5-minute sort of update and then go straight to questions and try to get as many of your questions in. That's my priority. If you do already have a sort of pre-prepared question or you're ready to say something, once the Minister gets going, put your hand up so I can sort of note who wants to get in. I'll try and get as many questions in as possible and keep the Minister online for as long as possible as well. And then we're going to go to a discussion with myself. Sorry to be sort of slightly egotistical in that I've just finished the net zero review, and we thought it was a good idea for members and associates to be able to have a opportunity just to have a briefing from me about the review, its processes, its recommendations, and also to ask me questions up until our 3 o'clock slot. So I'm just sort of waiting to see from our Secretariat whether we've got Minister Stuart on the line at the moment. We do.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Oh, you are there. Great. Sorry. Graham, thanks very much.
I don't see my picture on the screen, so I don't know if I'm coming through. It looks.
We can hear you. We can hear you very well.
See me? I can't.
I can see I can see your name, but I can't see your face yet. But that's not a bad thing. But I'm sure sort of you will pop up very shortly. In terms of the format, Graham, we know you've got to go at 2:15. So I don't know whether you wanted to start by giving a sort of update, new year, new broom and all that. And we're delighted that you've been able to continue as Minister and even add, I think, energy to your title as well as climate, but maybe to give an update both domestically and internationally about your priorities for 2023, the legislation you'll be taking through, and also the international engagement that I know you're working really hard on as well. I'm going to hand the floor to you. If you're able to speak maybe to up to 5 minutes max, and we'll go straight to questions. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I was, yeah, because my original thing was probably going to be a sort of 10-minute speech, so I won't be able to cover all that. But thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank you, Chris, for your net zero review, Mission Zero, which was published earlier in the month, and I was delighted to introduce you at the launch. We're considering the recommendations and will respond as soon as possible. I'm really grateful for the work that the APPG does, because we've got to make sure the environment stays right at the centre of our political thinking. And I look forward to working with you and the members of the APPG going forward. Climate is obviously a global issue, and we'll only succeed if we work together to protect our planet, with our share of global emissions being so passingly small and the Chinese ever more enormous and mountainous. Some people ask, why should we bother? And what the rationale I have for that is that we are leaning ahead of other countries, and we can be proud of that, decarbonising more than any other G7 country since 1990. And we should very much look to develop technologies and solutions which help us deliver that, but which can then give us a long-term exporting opportunity as well, which I know is a major feature of your report. But I thought I'd talk about international collaboration at COP27, where we saw a breakthrough on funding arrangements for loss and damage. Developed nations have committed to help the world's most vulnerable populations manage losses due to climate change on both mitigation and adaptation. And that means that we will support them not just to limit climate change, but to build resilience to face the challenges of a warmer climate too. And of course, that was brought into sharp relief by the devastating floods in Pakistan, a once-in-a-century event made significantly more likely as the result of climate change. And of course, one of the results of climate change is things that we thought of as once in a century seem to start happening, unfortunately, more often. Unless we take collective action to tackle these issues, then, as I say, these will become more common. So we must redouble our efforts to prevent greenhouse gas emissions. We must also prepare to be able to allow communities and countries and economies to be resilient too. And that's why the UK is proud to lead the pack in protecting the most vulnerable societies. As part of the 11.6 billion commitment, which, if you remember, was doubled, we have supported 95 million people better adapt to climate change, and 58 million people now have improved access to clean energy. But even with our international engagement, and I'm delighted that we've gone from just 30% of global GDP covered by net zero pledges in 2019, when we and ALOC took on the COP presidency, to 90% by the time we handed it over to Egypt. That's enormously important that the world, and to those skeptics, and I have time for skeptics, I don't think they should be pushed out of the conversation. I think everyone's point of view is valuable to show that the rest of the world is following in our lead. And that's one of the reasons why, as your report makes clear, we think there's enormous economic opportunities. The economic opportunity is in this space going forward. But 1.5 degrees remains on life support, and it's clear we need to do much more ahead of COP28 in the UAE. And we want to make sure that momentum on 1.5 degrees is not lost, and that we can make sure that we see real progress this year, more progress than we saw at Sharm. Just on a note on energy security, just given that we've got pressures today on our electricity system, the UK does have one of the most secure and diverse energy networks in the world, and we're doing all we can to bolster it further, generating clean, affordable, reliable energy to drive growth for the economy of the future. Right now, just under half of our electricity is created from zero carbon sources, and we are constantly adding capability to the grid. So offshore wind, which is particularly relevant to me, given my constituency in the East Riding of Yorkshire, we saw the completion of Hornsea 2, the world's largest offshore wind farm. And I think 2022 saw records repeatedly broken in a year when wind supplied more than a quarter of our electricity. But we need to keep going further and celebrate the CFDs, because at the time of high prices, of course, the CFDs have seen generators paying hundreds of millions back in to subsidize bills. And the more we can increase that capacity, the quicker we can reduce our dependence on gas and have it as so much of the time as the price setter for our electricity system. I'm aware there's people wanting to ask questions. I could touch on everything from decarbonisation of homes. I'm pleased on the progress we've made, and we've got £6.5 billion being spent in this Parliament, and a recent announcement from the Chancellor to seek to cut overall energy demand in the UK by 15% by 2030, with an additional £6 billion of government funding for the 2025 to 2028 period, and the announcement of a new energy efficiency task force, which my colleague Lord Callanan will be co-chairing with I hope soon to be announced co-chair. So on a number, we're pushing forward on a number of fronts, but this is a really critical number of weeks. We delayed our response to the Climate Change Committee report for your to allow for your review and our response to it. We've got our response to the judicial review, which asked for more details on our net zero strategy. We have a green finance strategy launch, a whole series of really critical statements on government policy, which I hope can come out giving confidence to industry to invest, and confidence to all those who are concerned to ensure that the UK stays on its net zero path. That's enough from me, Chris. I'll hand back to you, and then time for a couple of questions.
Thank you, Graham. We've got our Deputy Chair, Caroline Lucas, has got a hand up, and we've got a number of other officers also on the call. If they want to raise their hands, also, we come to them first before taking other questions. Caroline.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Graham. Yes, two very quick ones. On the Energy Charter Treaty, which, as you'll know, allows foreign investors to sue countries if they believe that a decision of the country is running counter to their financial interests. So, for example, you have RWE launching a €1 billion claim against the Netherlands because of its decision to exit coal. Because of the concerns about the powers of that treaty, we know that Italy has already left it, that France, Germany, Netherlands, Poland and Spain have all announced that they're going to leave it. I would love to know where the UK is thinking that it is at when it comes to the Energy Charter Treaty. And then very quickly on the second point about, are there any plans, and maybe this is more of also a conversation with you, Chris, around changing the way the grid works so that it's not so centralized and so that we can get more renewable energy onto the grid? Because on the one hand, it's great to have all these targets around renewable energy, but if we can't actually feed them into the grid because it's overstretched, then we're not going to get to where we need to be fast enough.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. On the ECT, Energy Charter Treaty, I mean, our position is that we support modernising it, which we think can get the right balance, but we also note so many other parties, as you rightly say, leaving it. So our position at the moment is that we are considering, we're watching what's happening with that modernisation, whether it is or is not going to come to fruition, and we're watching what others are doing as well. So it's a pretty sort of that's been my public line for a while, and it continues to be. On the grid, I mean, you're absolutely right. For me, I've been taking on this role. We've got this transformation of our energy system to go through, role for everything from SMR nuclear, gigawatt nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture, floating offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, and on roof and ground mounted and all the rest of it. But if you haven't got the grid, the thing's for naught. So I absolutely am seized, as you are, with the importance of grid. Because of the scale of the investment and the scale of infrastructure, we needed to move to a more kind of holistic approach, and there's the holistic network design, looking at that to try and make sure we minimize onshore infrastructure, that we're sensitive to it, that there is community benefit for those who host it going forward if we're going to be able to deliver it. Because I think the president of National Grid said that we will need 6 times more investment in grid over the next 7 years than we've had in the last 30. And that is an enormous challenge. And if we don't do it, then all the other stuff we're doing is undermined. So I agree with you. One of the energy security bill, which will be coming to the Commons in the not too distant future as it completes its passage, to broadly popular acclaim in the Lords, will be has elements in there around trying to look at structuring the grid in the best way to allow that kind of competition where appropriate. So thank you, Caroline. I'll try and make my answers quicker next time.
Could I now thank to another officer of the group, Baroness Julia Brown of Cambridge, who is also chair of the House of Lords Climate Committee. Baroness Brown.
Hello, I'm chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee.
Sorry, my secretary, I got it wrong. Apologies.
I just quickly wanted to ask, particularly with what I think are the excellent ambitions for increasing offshore wind, but when are we going to see a coherent energy storage strategy for the UK, in particular, including long-term storage?
Well, thank you for that. In terms of electricity, I mean, clearly we're one of the benefits of hydrogen would be that it might offer that, but the there are a number of elements to come together to try and make sure that we can mitigate against the intermittency and ensure, and we will further we'll have the opportunity. I don't know whether how much you've got involved in that debate while the energy security bill has been traversing through the Lords, but clearly storage is and balancing mechanisms all round are very terribly important to optimize our use of renewables, but the hydrogen piece is an important part of it.
Well, that's why we need a strategy, if you don't mind me saying.
I hear your point.
Adam Vaughan, would Adam like to come in?
Hello, Minister. It's Adam Vaughan here from the Times. Just 2 questions, please. Just we've got you're due to issue a revised net zero strategy by the end of March. What areas or policies can we expect you to focus on? And my second question was, is greenlighting a coal mine consistent with the UK meeting its net zero ambitions by 2050? Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. And probably I need to go. It might be or might not be the last. Am I getting told the last question? On the net zero strategy in March, well, it's coordinating all the elements together. It's making sure that we split up the burden between, if you like, between different sectors. And we will be updating on progress there and plans for the future to make sure that we can deliver it. So it's across the piece. Obviously, for me as the Energy Minister, the focus is very much on the continued decarbonisation of our electricity system and working with other departments, making sure that the broader energy is decarbonised over time, recognising that more than 3/4 of our energy today is from fossil fuel. On the issue of the coal mine, it's a coking coal mine. I mean, it's, you know, I think it would be helpful, Adam, if journalists were made very clear. We've gone from, I think, 40% coal in 2012 to...
I think we're all reported on that, Graham, and all pointed out that it was coking coal, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, well, it's funny how many people get confused by, I mean, it's a coking coal mine, and I don't think anywhere, even the green steel making plant in Sweden can make steel yet without using coking coal. So it is, in order to have the steel that goes into our wind turbines, you need coking coal, and it is going to be a net zero production coking coal mine, as far as I know, and therefore, if while it's being used, you can displace foreign produced coal, which is dirtier than domestically produced coal, then you are contributing to net zero. So I think the inspector, I know it's subject to legal challenge, so I don't know whether I've gone too far already, but the inspector looked at this very carefully and thought it was compatible with net zero, and I, from first principles, see that it absolutely is, and would urge others to recognise that. I'm sorry, I've got to, it doesn't matter whether the coal is being exported, because as long as it displaces, if coking coal is required for steel, which it is, and our coal displaces coal that doesn't have net zero production, then we are contributing to the environment. We are going to be using fossil fuels all the way on the net zero journey from now to 2050 and beyond, and making sure that we do it in the way that has the lowest environmental impact, rather than viewing all fossil fuels as fundamentally the spawn of the devil, is going to be a more constructive approach. We're in a transition, and as I said, Caroline, at a recent debate, there is no red button which we could press that ends all use of fossil fuels tomorrow. There isn't. What we're doing is doing everything we can to reduce the demand for those over time, with mandates on vehicles, by supporting the greening of buildings and all the rest of it. It's the demand side is the most important point, and I don't think that a new oil and gas license in the North Sea nor a coal mine will drive a problem. And what we need to do is make sure that they are producing the greenest fossil fuel products they can, while we control using carbon budgets. And our net zero strategy, we remove the demand side, which is the key to helping us move to net zero. I'm sorry, I've got to run, Chris.
Thank you, Graham.
Other questions, but lovely to see you, and look forward to continuing to work with the members.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time today, and hope your urgent question goes well. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well, members, associates, thanks very much for attending that sort of ministerial briefing. In terms of the questions, James McSweeney and Associate Sian had questions. I know, apologies, we didn't get round to those. If you wanted to let us know, we might be able to pass them on to the ministerial team. So if you wanted to write them into the chat box, send them to me directly, and I can try to sort of relay them, or I might be able to answer them, you know, not on behalf of the minister, but sort of give my reflections on your questions in my contribution now. So obviously we just covered a sort of a topical issue that obviously I'm sure will remain highly topical for some time. We're going to turn now to the Net Zero Review, which was published last week. I was chair of this review, so I had to sort of recuse myself from officially doing things in public with the APPG, and I thank the Secretariat for their sort of patience while I sort of conducted the review. I was asked by the previous Prime Minister, Liz Truss, to conduct an independent review, and I'll come on to the sort of nature of its independence sort of later on, to look at how we can achieve net zero in a more affordable, efficient way that was pro-business and pro-growth. And obviously, all of us on this call, I'm sure, understand the opportunities net zero provides to be pro-business and pro-growth, to really sort of counter those false narratives that somehow net zero is going to make us colder and poorer, or is going to be an inordinate cost on the rest of the population. When we recognize, actually, when we look at the transition, the dynamics behind this transition, the UK has always been a leader when it comes to green technologies, when it comes to looking at the opportunities to deliver on renewable power. I think, as Minister Stuart mentioned, the fact that we've reduced our usage of coal has come on the back of a huge expansion in offshore wind, of which we saw a record on the 30th of December 2022, when we saw, I think, sort of offshore wind and nuclear together and other forms of clean power take up 80% of all electricity being produced by renewables and clean power. But the review took place over sort of 3-month period. I didn't have very long to conduct it, but I often say that 3 months is 1% of our journey towards net zero. And I had a choice when putting the report together. Did I sort of take a strategic approach, produce a short report that maybe targeted quite closely a number of sort of barriers of opportunities that maybe the UK should seize, or shall I be quite sort of comprehensive in my approach? And I had a great team. I had about 20 civil servants drawn from across BEIS, DEFRA, DIT, Bank of England, to be able to work on the review. And I decided that, I see net zero as a whole of society approach. I really needed to throw everything at it. So we held 52 evidence roundtables, some online like this, some in person. We went to every devolved nation of the UK, most of the regions in England, and tried to make it the most comprehensive engagement on net zero that a independent report has done to date. And we received also 1,800 written evidence submissions. Many thanks to the associate members who contributed to that. And the rich sort of tapestry of evidence that we received meant that I sort of decided we had to sort of split the report into 2 parts. The first part, part 1, is really sort of trying to set a new narrative on net zero. This isn't just an environmental policy, absolutely vital though that is. Net zero does provide that industrial policy for us to be able to look at how we can support manufacturing communities, how we can support sort of new inward investment, new technologies, new green tech, and at the same time maintain a UK's leadership on climate policy for the future. But often that narrative gets cast aside when it comes to certain parts of the media or certain sort of individuals who obviously try to campaign on this sort of net zero as a religion or an eco project. It's the very minimum, I've always felt that we could be doing in order to balance our economy and to bring the rest of society with us. And so, I've decided to, when it came to looking at the report, trying to set out what is the economic case. And we had sort of additional analyses that was done by McKinsey and another consultants that show there's roughly around £1 trillion worth of inward investment that is ready to be spent, a wall of capital that could either come to the UK or it can go elsewhere. And having been the minister who signed net zero into law, obviously there's been enormous progress internationally on achieving net zero, both COP26 and COP27. COP27 very much focusing on delivery and implementation. And I've tried to set out this net zero review, Mission Zero, as a sort of delivery and implementation framework. But nevertheless, that money can go elsewhere. The states with the Inflation Reduction Act, Germany or the EU with their Green Deal, this year in 2022 has really sort of, I think, changed the dynamic. On the back of Russia's illegal war in the Ukraine, it is now the case that countries are turning to renewable and clean power to be able to deliver on energy security, not just on reducing their carbon dioxide emissions. So we've got to recognise the world's changed, and that was also one of the key themes of the report. And aside from setting out that new economic narrative, which I'm keen that actually the media sort of did focus on, we then looked at, not how do we review net zero? It's a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, with the net zero review. We were never reviewing the 2050 target. We were never looking to somehow sort of change or provide instability by getting rid of the mandates that were set. Rather, it was to look at the commitments that were made by government and ask ourselves the questions: are those commitments strong enough? Could they be changed and brought forward, or do they need to be adapted in a way that's going to help encourage business and industry to get behind them? Because we know if we can build things at scale, if we can build out supply chains, that brings down the learning cost of the technologies themselves, and then you achieve net zero in a more affordable, efficient way. And the essay question that I was set, that question I've answered by saying, if you want to achieve net zero and make it more affordable and do it in an efficient way, you do it at scale, you get on with the job, because the cost of delaying means that the price only goes up. And there's a quote in the report which suggests that if we delay net zero measures by 10 years, potentially we add an extra 28% to our debt GDP. So it's absolutely vital economically that we move on net zero for the future. But then in terms of ensuring the net zero pathways, we had 6 pillars. I'm sure some of you who attended the roundtables might be sick of, but basically it was securing net zero. So the first pillar was very much thinking through the basics. And that's also one of the key things about the report. And Caroline mentioned grid, and we've had discussions in the past about sort of grid. If we don't get the underpinning infrastructure, the commitments that we need, both in terms of skills, materials, critical minerals, we will not be able to deliver on net zero. So understanding where we need to achieve that sort of domestic supply chain, that domestic manufacturing base for the future, at the same time as working with our international partners on building out international supply chains, was absolutely critical. Why I put that in sort of pillar 1. Then pillar 2 was powering net zero. So this was very much going sector by sector, talking to each industry and saying, what are the barriers that are holding you back? Where would you like to go further, faster? And what do you see as the opportunities if you were set that opportunity? And so looking again at some of the delays in the system, sort of understanding that we've got these government strategies, we've got targets set by Whitehall, but what is actually the reality of communities, companies, organizations and businesses raring to go, but actually being sort of held back, and trying to sort of understand what policy changes are needed to unleash this big bang moment on net zero. And when it comes to a big bang moment, I also saw that delivery from the centre is key, and we call for an office for net zero delivery, a number of task force to help unblock some of the delays that are taking place. But we've got to be able to trust regional and local government more to be able to set out and deliver on their own net zero ambitions. Now that means obviously allowing the Manchesters and the Glasgows to get on with it, and we call for a net zero sort of city project, but at the same time work with those other local authorities that might struggle in the future with their capacity and capability building to be able to deliver on net zero. And with that, we recognise that the planning system isn't fit for purpose when it comes to delivering on our climate commitments. That coal mine would never have happened if we'd had a planning system that was fit for purpose, that recognised net zero and our climate commitments within the NPPF, within the rights and responsibilities of local authorities, which is why we've called for statutory duty on net zero to be recognised as one of the key responsibilities for local authorities, why we've called for the NPPF to be reflective of the fact that we need net zero tests within the planning system. And at the same time to provide that additional support around funding and investment that doesn't allow local authorities to continually sort of compete for pots of money that then vanish after a year if they haven't completed the project. We need that sort of certainty, stability, clarity and consistency of approach. And in terms of the policy frameworks, we have 129 recommendations in the review. Now, obviously, not all those recommendations can be done in the next 1 year or even the next 2 years, and I wouldn't want them to be. Some of those recommendations are for long-term frameworks that need to be set out, programmatic structures that can help reduce the cost of net zero by providing certainty for investors, certainty for businesses to develop their supply chains, bringing down the overall cost. So I divided the review up into sort of 2 parts of the policy recommendations. The first was the 25 by 25, 2025 that is, that I believe that this administration should be able to achieve and get on with, recognising we've got a general election in October 24, which probably means legislative clock cuts off at July 2024. So let's get on with the job. And that's all about getting the basics right. Well, I talked about in the securing net zero pathway around making sure that we provide the ecosystem, the environment and the certainty that's needed to deliver for the future. But then we have 10-year missions in the report, which is why it's called Mission Zero, because the overwhelming evidence I received was not just about getting on with the job, it was providing that long-term certainty. And we see this being developed elsewhere. Yeah, Germany, the Netherlands, they've got 10-year energy efficiency investment programs. You know, in contrast, the UK government has these sort of start-stop project-based approach to the concertinas every time that it sort of collapses under its own weight, or hasn't got the skills base that's been developed alongside the investment that's needed. So having long-term certainty over a number of projects is key. So we call for a solar rooftop revolution, for example, which would both be, you know, sort of looking at how we can expand solar farms, but also how we can expand domestic solar to the point of 70 gigawatts by 2035. Again, looking at the planning system to be able to engineer that, and also the grid system, the interconnector system to be able to make that possible. Then we have an onshore wind mission, recognizing the real importance of carrying on full steam with our offshore wind commitments, but looking at what onshore wind could achieve. And while we don't set a formal sort of target, we recognize closely in the review that it should be around 30 gigawatts by 2030, 35 gigawatts by 2035. But at the same time, we've got to be able to, you know, de-risk these projects by coming up with new forms of community consent measures that actually allow local communities to work with renewable industry to come up with a site locating strategy and making sure that this is possible for the future. We also have additional missions on nuclear, on industrial decarbonisation. We've got additional missions on looking at local net zero Big Bang, for example, other ones on science and technology and R&D for the future. But nevertheless, that 10-year pathway certainty is one of the other reasons why I've been really keen to secure cross-party support for the review. Some of you may think, well, as you're a Tory MP, you've been given the job to be an independent chair by a Tory government, surely it's a stitch-up. Yeah, I nearly became an independent MP after the fracking vote when I decided to sort of put my future in the hands of trying to pursue net zero rather than have confidence in the government on that particular vote on fracking. And that was obviously a fork in the road for me. But nevertheless, I've taken this cross-party duty really seriously. I've met with all political parties, in particular, obviously, the Labour Party, the SNP, the Green Party, the Welsh Government. I even met with the Net Zero Scrutiny Group to discuss, you know, the fears and concerns that those who aren't supportive necessarily of taking action on net zero have. And one of the recommendations actually for net zero homes, it was actually Craig McKinley was very keen to make sure that new households, you know, when they bought new homes, weren't going to have to retrofit in future. So I've tried to sort of reach out to as many people as possible, and we now have a number of MP engagement sessions. I've written a letter to every single member of Parliament, so if they want to come and see me to discuss the report, I'll be making that offer available to House of Lords, you know, also shortly. Really keen to maintain a cross-party dialogue and consensus, you know, on the report going forwards for the future. In terms of, finally, just to sum up, because I realise I want to sort of get onto questions. Other pillars, aside from looking at that local net zero pillar, included a pillar on net zero in individual householders, how we can, again, de-risk the cost of capital investment, energy efficiency measures, heat pumps, EVs for the future, how we can provide more information to people to make responsible choices on their carbon footprints for the future, whether that's through looking at a carbon calculator or eco-labelling. There's additional work in the report on how we can support those industries such as energy intensives or agriculture to help make their own net zero transition realisable for the future and unleash the potential that those industries have within the UK. And then finally, the sixth pillar is net zero in the future. Because obviously the future is going to be very different in 10, 15 years' time. So trying to understand, you know, what do we need to focus on now as the UK in order to show leadership? And I sort of strongly believe understanding the future of the new carbon economy is going to be vital. So where do we go with the voluntary carbon market? Where do we go with regulated carbon standards? Where do we go with regulated low carbon product standards for the future in order to ensure that the UK can not just produce a net zero transition that's fit for the UK? I passionately believe that the way we're going to achieve a successful net zero transition is if we look to develop the products, the materials, the standards, the innovations that will be globally applicable. And that's a really important part of the review, because at the same time as recognising the international opportunities of inward investment for the UK, you know, we're in this global net zero race. We're also having this opportunity for global net zero cooperation. And I'm really keen that we don't sort of go down the path of energy sovereignty, which I see as different from energy security. Energy sovereignty being every country getting on with creating its own sort of net zero pathway, looking after its own sort of net zero supply chains, onshoring every single industry imaginable to try to focus on net zero. That's one of the weaknesses, I think, with the Inflation Reduction Act, is that sort of that sense of protectionism that is placed on American businesses as part of developing the net zero transition. We are going to need to be able to develop international supply chains and work with our international partners on these common shared challenges. So trying to ensure that the UK can really play a role in trying to develop that for the future is key to the report as well. I've gone on quite a long time. I'm sorry to sort of rant on about the report, but obviously it ended up being longer than I thought. If I'm honest with you, when we start, I sort of set myself a target of 200 pages. As an author, I always think, well, like, what's the word limit? Unfortunately, the word limit sort of overran slightly to about 130,000 words, 340 pages. Thanks to everyone who's taken the time to read it, or at least sort of read the executive summary and the recommendations. But really looking forward to sort of engaging with those recommendations in advance of the government response, which, as Graham said, hopefully might sort of come around 31st of March, which is obviously the legal deadline for the government to respond on its net zero strategy. So thank you, and open to questions. Who would like? We've got James and Baroness Sheenan have their hands up. Would you like to ask a question as well again, and then we?
Yeah, James had his hand up first. I'll let him go first.
Yeah. James, would you like to come in?
Hi, thank you. That's very kind. So my question, I put in the chat, it pertains to energy security. So for every gigawatt of intermittent generation capacity you build, you need a gigawatt of non-intermittent generation capacity. I can't find official projections for 2035, but if we conservatively assume 65 gigawatts of peak demand, that would require the equivalent of about 50 EPR reactors or 25 Hinkley Cs. At current build rates, that would take about 3 centuries. If we upped it to 1.5 power stations per decade, it would take 170 years. SMRs are exciting, but we're meant to be able to build about 1 a year in the 2030s, and we need the equivalent of 176. Again, carbon capture storage, exciting, but if you compress 1,000 pounds of CO2 into a cubic inch, that would require 1.7 cubic miles of storage a day, which doesn't sound practical. And lastly, data from New England suggests that backing up the grid with batteries adds $150 to $800 per megawatt hour, which is obviously not practical, and prices are obviously going up. So I guess my question is twofold. Given we're meant to make this switch over in 2035, what is our estimate for peak demand? And secondly, what non-intermittent net zero generating capacity can we expect to meet this demand?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, in terms, I can't speak for BEIS, given the report sat separately from BEIS. However, obviously, some of the graphs I think that are in the report certainly received from the evidence around obviously creating a net zero power supply by 2035 demonstrates a enormous infrastructure challenge. When you sort of look at the graph and it sort of shoots up like this, and it probably is, out of all the sort of net zero transitions, the one that I would be most concerned about in terms of whether we're going to be able to achieve that for 2035, given the scale of the infrastructure requirement that needs to be built out. And why, obviously, the report makes the case that, we look at and it's, I think, probably, the capacity that's needed, the delays in existing projects that are needed to meet the capacity. You have some of these, the grid connections won't be in place to 2031. And so that's one of the, I think, the sort of, wake up and smell the coffee moments that Net Zero Review intends to provide, is to sort of say you can't will this transition into action, and we've got to be able to work out a technology roadmap. So one of the key recommendations, obviously, is working backwards to sort of demonstrate this is what we will be needing by 2050, this is what we're needing by 2040, 2035. So we've called for the government to produce the calculations that you've asked in parts A and B by the end of 2033. Sorry, 2023. Sorry. So in terms of actually, the question is one that I'm not sure is properly has been sort of solved and needs to be solved, and that's why we've made the recommendation that we take this seriously and that we work backwards with the technology roadmap in order to plan for the future. Baroness Sheehan, would you like to come in? I've got a couple of questions I can read out in the chat.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the net zero review. It's well received by me anyway. My question is quite a simple one. Do you think we need to change the language? The energy transition sounds too benign now. Do we need to talk more about transformation? That we need to inject a sense of urgency into action. I'm not sure the word transition does it anymore.
I think the point you make on language is really well made. Trying to sort of frame, how we've got to be able to deliver and the time we've got to be able to deliver, and also, the challenge with net zero is net zero 2050, but that's not what we need to be focusing on. It's 2030, and some of the challenges to the 70% sort of emissions reduction by 2030 seem to get lost, I think, in the discussions around net zero, and that sense of trying to, I think, it's important that we have the transition, that we don't make people sort of fearful. That we understand that there is an opportunity to be able to make the switch, and this can happen. But the sense of the transformation and is a valid one, and balancing how we can. I think the key question I always think is that, how do we frame the language in a way that isn't such doom and gloom that people think, well, they throw their hands up and say, well, we can't do anything about it. And that is the real challenge. I do think we can achieve change, and we can deliver as a human society on meeting this challenge. It's trying to make sure the language isn't so fearful that people just sort of think, let's just give up anyway.
Oh, no, I completely get that. But anyway, I'll let others come in.
Baroness Brown, would you like to come in? And
Well, just really sort of going back to what I asked the Minister a little bit, which is that don't we need slightly more than a technology roadmap, for example, for the power system? Don't we need some high-level vision for its architecture? If we're really going to get all of this offshore and onshore wind and the energy storage and the nuclear or the small modular reactors and things, don't we, we haven't actually got very long, and leaving it to a lot of slightly loosely linked bits of the market, I feel is not going to deliver us in the time scale we need. We really do need to make sure that government is absolutely clear about what incentives it needs to put in place to get different bits of this system to be developed on time. Because, I mean, for example, on energy storage, we still have many parts of issues of energy storage on the grid that in many areas storage is still counted as generation, and therefore has issues when it charges up and issues when it discharges. In the regulations, it's still treated as generation, and that disincentivizes some of these really critical parts of the system. And so unless we have a vision for what the system looks like, unless we have some overall architecture, I really can't see us getting this done in time.
I think it's a question we did sort of think about. Are you trying? I guess are you looking at sort of some large nationalized framework structure for the future, or at least a nationalized strategy that sort of like will impose? We went for task forces in the end to basically really sort of focus on the challenges that some of each sector faces. I guess the challenge for me within the review was you can sort of map out a centrally planned system, but would that disencourage the government's not going to pay for all of this? So sort of understanding the role of the private investor and how you can create a system by both which public and private can invest in the future is a delicate balance. I don't think there's whether the review has got the sort of perfectly formed conclusions on this. At least I hope that it would provide an ecosystem which more conclusions could be readily drawn. Primarily, looking at some of the regulators that haven't had net zero at the heart of their function is one of the things that needs to happen first and foremost, to be able to make sure that people stop working against the transition and start working for it. So it is a really good question, and one that I don't necessarily sure I have a fully formed 100% opinion of whether we should have a fully planned sort of system, but sometimes trying to work out how fast we can deliver on that is also something where having a nationalised planning sort of framework that would potentially sort of be held at the heart of government may not work in favour of speed. We've got a couple of questions. James, did you want to come back in again? You got your hand up still, or I've got some questions in the chat box still.
Sorry, that was a mistake. I'll put it down.
Okay, cool. So we've got Jim Clark. Jim says that the Net Zero Review recommends simplifying the local net zero funding landscape to make it more efficient and productive for both central and local government. This would be welcome for our customers at Zurich Municipal. What is your view on more central government funding for local authorities to finance adaptation and resilience work in the community to reduce risks? So I think the question on sort of adaptation and finance for local authorities is a really good one. It's one where we've called obviously for looking at sort of a land use strategy in the report as well, because understanding the changing uses of land as a result of adaptation is important. And obviously, I guess the question around sort of local authorities is what forms of adaptation, what forms of resilience we'd wish to look at. Obviously, coastal sort of communities, the costs of not developing certain forms of resilience for the future, are also sort of implicit. And so I guess the question would be how you develop the funding bids themselves. But principally, whether it's to do with adaptation, resilience, or mitigation, the key thing here is certainty. What we need to move away from is central government funds that are only open for a very short period of time. Often there is no advertisement to certain local authorities that the funding is actually being opened, and being clear to local authorities what they can apply for, why they can apply for it, and what they should be delivering is one of the things that we really need to strengthen, that relationship between central and local government, whether that's through local fora, whether that's through additional work. It's not there at the moment. And then also whether that funding is competitive or not. I sort of feel we're going to have to do many of these measures anyway. So why are we sort of creating a competition? We should have grant-based funding in place to be able to deliver. But I would expect also that we talk about local authorities. Certain local authorities will be facing very different specific challenges to other local authorities. So how we create the sort of typology of local authorities within a net zero framework, I think is also an interesting question for the future. We have a question from Caroline Lucas again, saying, can you say more about what regulatory changes you'd like to recommend to increase grid capacity and priority access for renewables? I think sort of for myself, obviously not just looking at sort of, there's broader questions obviously on infrastructure and grid and understanding how this relates to interconnectors and wider structure. I would say that there are a number of delays that are both not just driven by demand. We have a system at the moment, almost like land banking, where people are sort of have banked grid slots and aren't building them out. So whether we need to have regulatory reform to actually sort of strip that out and lose it or use it sort of principle. There are a number of problems also around capacity issues when it comes to renewable technologies such as solar, where there is a limit to capacity to the size of a solar farm that can be placed on the grid. And we believe that's actually regulations that are no longer potentially applicable in the modern world. The nature of technology has moved on to the point where we need to have a sort of root and branch review of whether some of these regulations that are being put in place are actually sort of hindering the pace at which innovation can happen for the future. Baroness Heyman, you've got your hand up.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the report, which has got so much in it and is very comprehensive and sets an agenda for years to come. I'm sort of interested, firstly, in your correct focus on getting local and community buy-in and innovation and energy into all of this, but how we get the right level of not a Stalinist national plan, but very clear direction of travel and prioritization from government, and just some thoughts on that. And it's particularly potent for me at the moment. You talked about regulators involved in 3 bits of legislation that will probably have gone through certainly our house by the time the government responds to your review. I mean, social housing regulator, the Ofgem, where we've got amendments down on the energy bill to give the regulator responsibilities, and financial services and markets bill, where it's really, really important in terms of unlocking finance and private sector finance. So just some reaction on how we get that framework clear from government, so we're not fighting individual battles one after another.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think trying to sort of create the long-term approach obviously was part of the mission. So there's sort of key missions that we have, obviously, not just in onshore wind, on solar, as I said, hydrogen. I'm really keen that we actually have a 10-year understanding of building out sort of hydrogen, building out CCUS. But at the moment we don't really move beyond the sort of artificial sort of tiered structures or demonstrator projects, which we put sort of money in comparison to the billions of pounds that Germany are now putting into hydrogen, for example. That's just one example of where we're going to fall behind in this net zero sort of race for the future, because we're not looking sensibly at how we can develop new technologies at scale over a long period of time. We're not looking at how we join up, say, for instance, like floating offshore wind. What's our plan there? When we talk to the sort of number of Welsh representatives, they have an enormous enthusiasm for building that out, but there's no sort of pathway to thinking about how we could potentially onshore some of those skills and manufacturing jobs, and at the same time as ensuring that then can even link up to the grid in Wales. And so there's a sort of wider sort of picture around some of those key technologies, which is why I think we went for the task force approach, by sort of saying this is the task force that then needs to be identified for this particular sort of technology and break through on that. Now, obviously, that still doesn't give you the bigger picture. That's, I think, been mentioned by Baroness Brown about sort of actually dividing up the what does the grid look like, and how do you ensure that the storage capacity is there, and we obviously have called for those cases to be sort of reviewed, but it is a tension, and I do sort of understand. I think probably from the financial perspective, for me, obviously the green finance strategy has been slightly delayed. Will be coming out, I think, at the end of March as well. But we've got to, I hope now the Treasury, for me, getting the Treasury to take this report seriously it would be the biggest win that I can have, because if the Treasury will buy into it institutionally over a longer period of time, it doesn't matter who's in government. It's trying to get to that sense of Whitehall to then sort of really understand the opportunity that the UK can take by focusing on net zero and not seeing it as a cost, this artificial sense of it just being a cost, and trying to move the dial away. And from the financial services perspective, I think for too long we focused on greening finance rather than financing green, and trying to get those levers in place that will make sure that the City of London can unlock the investment capital that's there. Still hasn't properly sort of taken place. And I think that's a dialogue that Jeremy Hunt's sort of willing to engage in. I think we might see some more work on that sort of very shortly, from what I understand from the Treasury. We got another question from Isabel O'Dowd. I don't know, Isabel, do you want to come in actually, rather than me read out your question?
Sure, it's actually Rick Parfitt deputising for Isabella on the
Sorry.
parade.
Sorry,
So,
Rick.
no, that's entirely fine. It's a misleading Zoom name, Chris. I was just saying, I think that it's a really good question for Baroness Hayman, striking that balance. And I think one of the most positive things we saw in the review was the focus on the need for this net zero financing strategy to crowd in a lot of the private investment rather than it just all being completely planned, and the focus on having Treasury consider and publish those climate impacts of the future spending reviews. I think together those are two really powerful mechanisms that can help guide investment and give the confidence and stability that you've been mentioning without government having to do it all itself. So Yeah, it was more a comment, sorry.
No, that's great. No, Anna Gellard also has come in. I don't know, Anna, if you want to make your point also around blue carbon.
Yes. Yeah, that would be great. I just put in the chat box that obviously the nature side of, there's been lots talking about terrestrial carbon credit trading and the problems of robust systems. As chair of the Policy and Markets Working Group for Blue Carbon, which seeks to kind of bridge the gap between DEFRA's evidence partnership, us in ENGOs and private sector. Just putting it out there for anyone involved in the call who want to be involved in that a bit more. I think we need to really, be thinking about those carbon credit trading schemes in the next, as soon as possible. And so there's some information about us. So again, more of a comment than a question, but I wondered, Chris, if you'd had any engagement on that already.
So I didn't have any engagement with blue carbon, apart from obviously, I think some of the written evidence that sort of came in. Obviously, what we've called for is that sort of net zero nature mission within the review. And what I'm keen to do is, partly, and I went down to Kent Wildlife Trust, saw wilder carbon, trying to see where are the opportunities, not just for restoration projects, but also sort of, to commit to existing sort of nature-based projects of protecting, what is there already. And I'm keen that when it comes to looking at this question around offsetting, and obviously we recognise there's a huge debate of, obviously the priority must be everyone must reduce their emissions as they are able to do so by as much as possible, and not to lean into offsetting in any way as a sort of alternative. But when it comes to this, growing economy, and it is going to be a growing economy, how can it be led in a way that will sort of, work towards sort of producing biodiverse nature solutions that, are recognisably credible and not sort of ones that run counter to biodiversity. And I'm also keen to make sure that this is a UK sort of led conversation as well for UK led projects. I talked to obviously international sort of collaboration and working with international organizations on other international projects on offsetting is fine. And obviously I offset all my carbon emissions as part of this sort of process, but I used the sort of gold standard website, but there wasn't any UK opportunities on that website that I saw. It was, I think in the end I invested in a solar farm in Rajasthan in India, which was fantastic. And obviously they can build that solar farm out, all the better. But I think trying to encourage sort of public consent for net zero would be great if we can sort of demonstrate to people this is happening on the UK shores. This is potentially what can be done for the future. And I know the APPG is really sort of trying to focus on a number of nature-based solutions in the UK to demonstrate all this exciting activity that's happening. So I'm really keen to maintain engagement in the short of it. And as I said, the report we're looking to pursue sort of how I can socialize it for the future. So if there's any invitations anyone wants to put out that we can come and sort of, I can come and visit or highlight, I'm really keen the report doesn't sort of end here. So just by way of sort of conclusion and in terms of so I know we want to finish at 3 o'clock. If there's anyone on the APPG associate members who are keen to sort of discuss the recommendations with a round table or to have a sort of potential visit in order to sort of, again, get this narrative out there that this opportunity is there for the UK on net zero, and there is a sort of pathway where there is sort of net zero on the one hand, there's not zero on the other hand, and the cost of not zero is going to be far greater than net zero. I'm sort of really keen to make that happen. I think one of the journalists asked me about the fork in the road question post fracking. I'm standing down at the next general election. I still remain a centre-right sort of politician, a Conservative politician. I believe that if we just have the net zero debate being sort of argued at from one particular political party, we've got to maintain a political consensus, and I'm determined to work within the Conservative Party to maintain the importance of net zero and highlight to my colleagues that it's highly relevant. But equally, stepping down from Parliament, I'm also really keen to pursue the opportunity to demonstrate that net zero is the solution to many of our problems for the future, both in terms of tackling climate change, but also in enhancing our economy. So I think with that, unfortunately, we're going to probably have to draw it to a close because we've reached sort of the 3 o'clock mark. But again, please do maintain engagement. And I hope you found sort of Minister Stewart's comments sort of enlivening, and no doubt we'll be wanting to work with him and obviously see what progress the government makes in the run up to its update on the net zero strategy by the 31st of March, which will hopefully include a response to the Mission Zero report. But look forward to working with everyone and seeing everyone at our next event. I should probably just let people know we have our next event is the 24th of February. Sorry, 24th of January. It's happening tomorrow. The Canadian High Commission between 4 and 5:30 p.m. for a discussion between Canada's Climate Ambassador Catherine Stewart and Lord Goldsmith, and that the Environment APPG Secretariat will be able to field any questions for those who aren't able to make that event. And we'll be sort of letting everyone know about our events that are being planned at the moment as we go forwards for the year ahead. So thanks everyone, and speak soon.